Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I know. So, uh, if time permits, I'll try to recap the whole thing once again. But I think you would have also watched the videos, right? Which has
Yes,
been
ma'am. Yes,
released.
ma'am.
Okay, okay, right. So today we'll start with Unit 13, Henry Derozio. Right. So, quick introduction about Henry Derozio. Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, 1809 to 1831, was an Indian poet of mixed Portuguese and Indian descent, often considered one of the first Indian educators and poets to express nationalist ideas in English. He was a teacher of Hindu College, Calcutta, and inspired young Indians to think critically about freedom, reform, and national pride. Though he died very young, at just around 22 years old, he was when he died, his influence was significant, and he is remembered as a pioneer of the Bengal Renaissance and a forerunner of Indian nationalism in English literature. He received early education from the radical Scottish schoolmaster David Drummond between 1823 and 1826. He briefly worked first as a clerk in a mercantile firm in Calcutta and then on an indigo plantation in Bhagalpur. He was a charismatic teacher. Derozio drew around him a group of Indian students who would later be known as the Young Bengal. And often the central point of this radical community was the debating society, the Academic Association, which Derozio established in 1828. He was also associated with the newspaper, the East Indian, in that was the newspaper where he was associated with. So in 1831, his views on religion and culture drew the ire of the authorities of the Hindu college. He had to resign from his position. Shortly afterwards, in the same year, he died in, say, around 1831. He died of cholera at the young age 22. His poetry stands as a witness to the formation of colonial modernity in early 19th century India. So, a robust English language public sphere emerged in Calcutta in the 1820s and 30s. For the first time, English language newspapers and periodicals published in the city convinced writers and readers. That an Indian literature in English and an Indian public could be created. Now, his poetry is full of echoes of English romantic poets, particularly Keats, Shelley, and Byron. Now, contemporary criticism is more attentive to Derozio's poetic genius and historical role. It does not see Derozio as merely imitating the English romantics. Rather, it sees him contributing to the formation of, as it were, a global romanticism. Now, Derozio's poetry is available in multiple collected works and anthologies. The two anthologies of 2005 and 2011, uh, situate the poet, as it were, in two different poetic contexts of early native Indian poets in English and of early Anglo Indian poets. Right. So today we are going to talk about the poem which is prescribed in your book, that is To India, My Native Land. Okay. And this is in the form of a sonnet. And this was originally published in The Fakir of Janzira, a metrical tale, and other poems in 1828. Now, it did not have the title To India, My Native Land, which was later assigned to it by F.B. Bradley Burt, who edited a collection of Derosio's poetry in 1923. Right. So, To India, My Native Land. Now, the first 8 lines of the sonnet articulate a self conscious engagement with history. It takes the shape of building a contrast between the past and the present of the country. The past was glorious and present is miserable. She was earlier soaring high like a proud and free eagle, and now she's chained down to the ground and has taken to groveling. So, this is about the native land he's talking. Right. The 4 lines in the middle suggest a course of heroic action. Unlike the traditional bards who dwell only on the miseries of the present, the poet will retrieve moments of past glory from the depths of time. Retrieval of a glorious history is imbued with a spirit of vital agency. The last 2 lines establish an almost chivalric relationship between the country and the narrator. Affection for the country is the only reward that the poet seeks for his labors. The country is imagined as deity with a luminous halo around her. She commands worship and reverence. The poet who retrieves the glorious history of the country is her favored knight. Self conscious engagements with history, emphasis on heroic action, and preoccupation with notions of bondage and freedom of a land and its people are markers of a colonial, romantic modernity that emerged in India in early 19th century. Now, here he describes India as a once glorious country, right? Past and the present is being compared here. And he also expresses deep love and sadness for India. He describes India as once very glorious country that has now fallen into slavery and misery under British colonial rule. And then the poet remembers India's past greatness and laments its current suffering. He longs for the lost pride and hopes to restore India's honor through his poetry. So it's this is basically a poem which is both a lament for India's fallen state and a tribute to its once majestic history. So filled with a sense of mourning, admiration, and patriotic hope. Right. Let us look into the theme of this poem, To India, My Native Land. It's basically a patriotistic kind of a theme where patriotism and national pride is being quite evident in this poem. The poet expresses deep love for India and mourns its lost glory. He celebrates India's past greatness and dreams of its revival. Colonial oppression. Derozio reflects the sorrow of a nation under British colonial rule, showing how India, once noble and free, has become subjugated. Right, that was what happened, right? Immediately after the Britishers have taken over. Nostalgia and lamentation. This is again another key theme of the poem. The poem looks back with sorrow at India's rich and proud history and grieves over its present degraded condition. Right. The tone of the poem, patriotic and reverent. So the poet here shows devotion and honor toward India and its past achievements. Then another kind of a tone you get to see is which is mournful and regretful. There's a strong sense of sorrow and loss for the fallen state of the country. Now, towards the end, this being a sonnet, we all know the last two lines, which are called as couplets, will actually show you what exactly it is going to take a turn, right? So it's a bit hopeful. Despite the pain, there is a desire to restore India's dignity and inspire pride through poetry. Now, let us look into the imagery which we come across in this poem: glorious past versus bleak present. So the poet creates a contrast using images of India once crowned with glory versus now chained in shackles. Chains and graves, these are powerful symbols of slavery, death, and loss of freedom. So you come across these in the form of a imagery here in the poem. A pilgrim at a shrine, a beautiful metaphor for the poet's devotion as he offers his poetry like a prayer at India's altar. Now, what are the poetic devices we come across in this poem to India, my native land? Apostrophe or apostrophe, the poet addresses India directly as it as if it were a person, my country, showing emotional intensity. Next is another device, which is the metaphor here. So here, India is described in noble terms, once a deity or a halo crowned, now in chains, right? Then coming to alliteration. Now you have a kind of a rhythm being induced because of this alliteration. Glory past and deeds of days, right? Then personification. India is personified as a fallen goddess or noble figure now in mourning. Sonnet form. The poem follows a Petrarchan sonnet structure, 14 lines with a clear division of thought and rhyme scheme. So, unlike uh, the sonnet which goes with sestet and octave, here it is like the Petrarchan sonnet. Next, we move on to another eminent poet of India, that is A.K. Ramanujan. So, after the poem, we will be able to understand some of the prominent themes that animate Indian poetry in English in the 20th century. And study the formal experimentation that Indian poetry in English carries out. Examine the historical process known as modernity in which Indian poetry in English is situated. Right. So let us quickly look into the biography or the life history of A.K. Ramanujan. He was a poet, a renowned Indian poet, a translator, and scholar, recognized for his works in both English and Kannada. He is considered one of the most influential modern poets in Indian literature. Ramanujan's poetry explores themes such as identity, memory, tradition, and cultural conflict. He often combined personal and cultural history, drawing from both the rich heritage of India and his experience as a diaspora writer in the United States. His works reflect a deep understanding of the complexity of Indian life, blending myth, folklore, and personal experience. Ramanujan is also known for his translations of classical Tamil poetry. He was a linguist and a folklorist born in 1929 to a family of Tamil Brahmins in Mysore, Karnataka. So, after his initial education in Mysore and Pune, he began his professional career as a lecturer in English in various colleges in South India. He went on to receive a PhD from Indiana University in 1963, and from 1962 till his death in 1993, he taught at the University of Chicago in the departments of South Asian languages and civilization and linguistics, as well as the Committee on Social Thought. His major volumes of poetry in English include The Striders, 1966, it was published, Relations, published in 1971, Second Sight, published in 1986, and posthumously The Black Hen, which was published in 1995. His translations from classical Tamil as well as Kannada were perhaps more well known in his own lifetime. The Interior Landscape, Speaking of Siva, Hymns for the Drowning, Poems of Love and War, and the posthumous When God is a Customer. Besides poetry, Ramanujan wrote several interpretive essays which are now considered to be classic. Like, for example, is there an Indian way of thinking where mirrors are windows, telling tales, the Indian Oedipus, etc.? Now, his contributions to the field of South Asian studies received due recognition in India. He was awarded the honor of Padma Shri in 1976. Now, he recognized his own poetry as a reaction against romanticism. So, for Ramanujan, the language of his creative writing was not a matter of conscious choice. Once, in response to a question as to why he wrote in English, the poet responded, many reasons, none of them literary. He put it down to the participants of his personal history. Long years of education in English and life in diaspora, far removed from his first language environment. So, use of English. So, use of language, English, Ramanujan felt separates writers like him from the great community of people of India and makes them dependent on cliques and coffee house elites. A small group of people writing in a second language, he simultaneously felt was something of an Indian tradition. People expressed themselves in Sanskrit and Persian languages that were hardly their mother tongues. Nevertheless, Ramanujan believed that Indian writing in English lacks the intensity output, variety, creativity, use of our past and present, or power of influence, which Indian literature in the Bhasa language has. Right. So let us quickly move on to The poem which has been prescribed, this which is we are supposed to be reading for A.K. Ramanujan works. So it's small scale reflections on a great house. Okay, so what is this poem basically about? So, in A.K. Ramanujan's poem, Small Scale Reflections on a Great House, the poet contemplates, he thinks that the relationship between the personal and the historical. The great house in the poem symbolizes both the grand traditions of the past and the individual's small role within it. The speaker reflects on how history, with its vastness and weight, can sometimes overwhelm the individual, leaving them feeling insignificant. The poem contrasts the speaker's personal memories and small scale reflections against the backdrop of larger historical or familial legacies, highlighting the tension between individual experience and collective history. Ramanujan uses the metaphor of the house as a way to explore themes of heritage, belonging, and self identity, focusing on how we understand our place in relation to the grandeur narratives of family, culture, and history. Okay, let us quickly look into the theme of this poem. Okay, a quick look into the summary, which is also given in your textbook. Ramanujan builds his poems around what he calls the human scene, and as he sets out to construct the scene in his own words, the line between the poem and the novel, the lyric and the story begins to blur. So the present poem consists of 10 long sentences. One can possibly treat each one as a short poem. So each one of these contributes to the lyrical and the novelistic aspects of the long poem. So they express feelings as well as narrate events. So these short poems are brought together by the central geographical metaphor, the great house. So the space of the house is such that whatever comes in never goes out, and anything that goes out eventually comes back in. So this hold all quality renders the house a great place. Okay. So the space of the house is also such that it never respects the Western demarcating line between the private and the public. Wandering cows are encouraged to get pregnant in the broad daylight of the street. The space is also such that it can refer to far off locales from Manchester to Sahara to Sialkot. So these short poems are all brought together by the small scale I, who reflects on the great house. Whatever it touches upon begins to tell metonymically a larger story. Be it the story of the old man and his office room, of cotton that travels across oceans, mills and shops, or of copper pots with Ganges water. The stories also travel across time from Alexander to 1943, and these sentences, both lyrical and novelistic, bring together the geographical and the temporal and create an elaborate allegory of modern India. Right. Now look at the theme of this poem. It is individual versus collective history. The poem reflects on the individual's small role within the larger context of family or cultural history symbolized by the Great House. It examines the tension between personal identity and historical or familial legacies, heritage and memory. The poem explores how heritage and memory shape one's sense of self, as well as the challenge of reconciling personal experience with inherited cultural narratives. Insignificance versus grandeur. The speaker struggles with feelings of insignificance when comparing his small scale existence to the grandeur of history and tradition represented by the Great House. Cultural reflection. The poem speaks to the complexity of understanding one's place in the context of a rich cultural heritage and how personal reflections often seem dwarfed by the weight of history. Coming to the tone, it's reflective and introspective, which is melancholic or pensive, subdued, and humble. So, when you talk about the reflecting kind of a tone, the tone is thoughtful and contemplative as the speaker ponders the significance of the great house and what it represents in relation to personal identity. It is melancholic. There is a subtle sadness or wistfulness in the tone as the speaker seems to grapple with the tension between the grandeur of history and the smallness of individual life. Subdued and humble. The speaker's tone suggests a sense of humility or self awareness about the fleeting and small nature of personal experience in the face of broader historical or familial narratives. Right. Coming to the poetic devices which we come across in this poem: metaphor, symbolism, contrast, enjambment, and irony. Right. The metaphor is the great house, which serves as a metaphor for the heavy historical and familial legacies that shape the speaker's identity. It represents not only the physical space but also the cultural heritage and family traditions that have accumulated over time. Next, symbolism. The house, often a symbol of shelter and belonging in this poem, becomes a symbol of the past, with its old walls representing tradition, memory, and the unchanging nature of history. Right. Contrast. Ramanujan contrasts the small scale reflections of the individual with the vastness and historical weight of the great house, highlighting the speaker's perceived insignificance. Then comes the enjambment. The use of enjambment, where sentences or phrases run beyond the line break, mirrors the continuity of thought and the sense of a long standing tradition that cannot be neatly contained or fully understood in a single moment. Right. Irony. There's an underlying irony in how the great house, which represents so much grandeur and history, is understood through the small individual reflections of the speaker, emphasizing the gap between personal experience and historical magnitude. Right. Coming to the imagery: physical imagery of the house, memory and reflections, imagery of the time, and continuity. Right. So, if you look at the physical imagery, the great house is described in vivid terms that evoke its size, age, and presence. Its wall and structure symbolize the strength and permanence of tradition and history. Now, coming to the memory and reflection, the imagery often involves mental reflections such as small scale reflections representing the mental process of considering one's place in relation to the vast house or the grandeur narrative. Now, imagery of time and continuity. See, the references to ancient stones and old buildings, they give us an image of the past, suggesting that history, like the house, is built layer by layer over time, and that individuals like the speaker are just one small part of a much larger structure. Right. Next, we move on to the 15th unit. I think this is the last but one, if I am right. Okay. This is the last one, in fact. Judith Wright. So here we have two poems, and this is the last one, in fact, the last unit. Right. I think I'll just do the introduction, and the poetry we can take it up tomorrow. The poems we
Okay,
will.
ma'am.
Yes, Pranati. So, coming to Judith Wright, was an Australian poet, environmentalist, and essayist, widely recognized for her poignant and powerful poetry that often dealt with themes of nature, identity, loss, and social justice. Wright's works explore the relationship between humans and the natural world, as well as Australian history. Now, please remember, now that we are into the Australian poetry, okay? So, we've done Canadian, we've done Indian, now we are into the Australian, where we already, I think, discussed just before beginning of this block 5. And block 5 is actually the block which talks about these three poetries of the three different places, the Canadian, Indian, and Australian. So with Ramanujan, we are completed with the Indian, and now we start with the Australian poetry. Right. Wright's works explore the relationship between humans and the natural world, as well as Australian history and the impact of colonization on the indigenous people. She became one of the most significant voices in Australian literature, and her writing frequently reflects a deep awareness of environmental issues and the complexities of national identity. Wright's poetry blends the personal and the political, focusing on the themes such as women's rights, family, and the tensions between tradition and modernity. And throughout her career, Judith Wright was actively involved in political campaigns and movements, including the anti war movement, Australia's conventionalist movement, and the movement to change the treatment of the country's Aboriginal people. Now, according to the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Australian writers, Wright's first book of poetry, The Moving Image, was published in 1946. And her second collection, Woman to Man, was published in 1949, which was considered to be the original for its frank treatment of sexuality from the female point of view. In 1964, Wright became the founding member of President of the Wildlife Preservation of Queensland. Also in the 1960s, she became involved in political action. She was well known for campaigning support for the Great Barrier Reef and Fraser Island, as well as being an advocate for the Aboriginal land rights movement. Most of her works consisted of themes that portrayed the Australian environment, relationship between settlers and Australians, relationship between mankind and then the environment, connections with the human experience and the natural world, and bridging the gap between nature and man. Because a lot of her work involved women and the role of women in the family and society, much of her work portrayed feminist themes as well. Wright was fearless in expressing her opinions. I mean, that is how she was quite bold in expressing her opinions, thoughts, and ideas. Her works portrayed feminist themes that helped express her ideas on gender discrimination, patriarchy, subjugation of women's intellect and talent. And she was the author of several collections of poetry, including The Moving Image, Woman to Man, The Gateway, The Two Fires, Birds, The Other Half, Magpies, Shadow, Hunting Snake, among others. Now, the present poem for study is Eve to Her Daughters. This is a poem which focuses on the themes of marginalization and subjugation of women. Revisiting the biblical myth of Adam and Eve, Judith Wright appeals to the women of the world not to show subservience in any manner and question patriarchal hegemony. So she was hell bent on writing a lot about the feminist kind of literature. She worked for women most of the time and for the upliftment of the women. Right. So this is all about the poet's biography, and we'll meet up again for the next session for the last remaining two poems. I think tomorrow we'll be finishing off these two poems which are prescribed. That is Eve to her daughters. One is Eve to her daughters, and the other one is Woman to Man. And yes, and then after this, we have some poetic terms which are quite important. Maybe I will quickly do a quick recap of whatever I've done all these days, and along with this, the terms, the poetic terms, I'll be uh, giving you a gist of it. Then, right. So tomorrow we'll be taking up these two poems which are written by her, Judith Wright. Right. For today, I'll be winding up the session. And tomorrow, when you are coming back, this is our last class. So you please go through the text, and it's given very well. Such an exhaustive text is there. And come prepared. If you have any doubts, we can have it clarified in the session tomorrow. Right, Pranati?
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah. That's it for today, Ma. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome to